The bangs are back, tucked back, because I cut them again. Hi there, thanks so much for joining me for another episode of Once Upon a Murder. Real quick, I do want to mention that there will be a part 2 to the Manson family murders. I mentioned in my last video that it would be my next video, but it's not. But there is a part 2 coming. Let's dive right in, because this one is a long one. So the lipstick killer is actually a serial killer who was charged for 3 different murders that all took place in Chicago in 1940s, 1945, 1946. The first murder that was accredited to the lipstick killer was that of 43-year-old Josephine Ross. She was found on June 5th, 1945, murdered in the apartment that she shared with her 2 daughters, who were 17 and 21 years old at the time. She was found posed on her bed with adhesive tape covering all her wounds. She had been repeatedly stabbed about 4 times in the neck, and she was washed of all her blood in the bathtub and posed on the bed with one of her skirts wrapped around her head. She was found to be clutching dark hair in her hands at the time of her death, and what they think happened was that she surprised an intruder, somebody who was burglarizing the home, and they then went on to attack her and kill her. However, in their search of the apartment, nothing valuable was really taken. 7 months after the murder of Josephine Ross, 32-year-old Frances Brown was discovered December 10th, 1945, and she was slouched over her bathtub and she had a butcher's knife through her neck. She was also shot in the head. She was stripped down naked. The blood was rinsed off of her just as it was with Josephine, and she was slumped over the bathtub, like I said, with it depends where you get your source from, but I've seen different things such as towels, pajamas, or sheets that were wrapped around her head. Written on the living room wall in lipstick, the killer wrote, "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." And this, obviously, is where the name Lipstick Killer comes from. Although he only left lipstick at 1 crime scene. Seems like you're jumping the gun a little bit on the name. Now, the third murder is definitely the most infamous one. It's kind of what got the most media attention. But about a month after Frances's murder, there had been a kidnapping. Around 7:30 in the morning on January 7th, 1946, 6-year-old Suzanne Degnan was found to be missing from her room. Suzanne was a 6-year-old blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl who lived with her mother, her father, and her 10-year-old sister in their home in Chicago. So her father reported her missing around 7:30, and this is the timeline of the night before. The Degnans had come home pretty late, and around midnight, both parents remember walking Suzanne to the bathroom, because she had to use the bathroom, and then walk her back to the bedroom. And then Suzanne's father remembers that after they walked her back to her room, it was around 12:30 when he had set his alarm for the next morning, and then he went off to bed. He calls and reports his daughter missing around 7:30, and the police were there by 10 a.m. Seems a little late to me. Essentially, by 10 a.m., they were searching the room. While the police were searching the room, they found a crumpled up note that said, roughly, "Get $20,000 ready and wait for word. Do not notify FBI or police. Bills in 5s and 10s. And on the back, it said, "Burn this for her safety." So, like I said, this note had been found around 10 a.m. But by this time, Suzanne was already dead. By 7 p.m., parts of her body were already showing up. She had been strangled to death and then mutilated using a hunting knife. Now, they don't know if she was killed in her bedroom or in the second location, but they know for a fact that she was dismembered in the laundry room basement of another apartment building that was less than a block away. When the coroner looked at Suzanne's body, they said that whoever committed it did a very clean job with absolutely no signs of hacking. So that kind of led people to believe that whoever it was had some sort of medical job, or, you know, had medical knowledge. Or maybe even a butcher is what they said. Definitely was used to cutting meat. Now, what connected her to the lipstick killer was that she was also washed and drained of blood, and her hair was shampooed. Her head was found first around 7 p.m. and it was floating in a catch basin, and then her legs and torso were found all separately in different sewers nearby. Her arms were found, however, over 2 months later, and so she was buried without them. The analysis of her digestive tract suggests that she was killed between 12:30 and 1 o'clock. So now, going back to this timeline, her father had been asleep by 12:30. They assumed that she was killed between 12:30 and 1 o'clock. There was a live-in worker who lived in the apartment above the Degmans, and her bedroom was directly above Suzanne's. She said that she heard around 12:50 in the morning the little girl say something to the effects of, "I'm sleepy," or something like that. And around the same time, the owners of the apartment upstairs, their dogs started barking, and they also testified that around that same time they both had to come downstairs to see what was going on with the dogs. In the building where she was dismembered, some of the tenants there said that they had heard some noises coming from the laundry room between 3 and 4 in the morning, and another tenant specified that they heard some water running around 2:45. When the police were showing up, there was somebody who was calling the Degnan household, demanding to know about the ransom, but then hanging up before any real conversation could be started, and they called several times. They picked up a local boy named Theodore Campbell, who was in connection to these calls, and he quickly admitted that another local teenage boy named Vincent Costello had killed Suzanne, and told him to call the Degnans in regards to the ransom. They questioned the boys and interrogated them overnight. They confessed pretty quickly. However, they failed their polygraphs, which was suspicious to police at the time, but we know that polygraphs aren't really real. So what really kind of led the police to think this wasn't anything is that their stories kind of just fell apart. There was a lot of inconsistencies, and finally they just admitted that they had overheard some of the policemen talking about the case and wanted to call to get in on the ransom money. So the next suspect that they honed in on was 65-year-old Hector Verberg. Hector was a Belgian immigrant who worked in the building that the Degnans lived in as a janitor. When they had him in custody, the police actually went out to the press and said, "This is the man." However, he wasn't as skilled as they thought the murder of Suzanne would have to be in order to drain her body of blood, and the precise cuts, it didn't add up. You know, he was a janitor, he didn't have certain skills that they were very positive they were looking for. However, they thought that the ransom note was so poorly written and dirty, and his hands were dirty, and he was an immigrant, and he worked in the building. Those were the only things that I could come up with why he was suspected. He was interrogated for 48 hours where he was badly beaten and essentially tortured. They even tried to pressure his wife into giving him up and saying that he did it. The 2-day interrogation was so rough that afterwards, Hector was in the hospital for 10 days. He actually was quoted saying, "Any more and I would have confessed to anything." In the end, it was determined that his English wasn't even good enough to write the poorly written ransom note. On top of the fact that he didn't even have the skills to begin with, he was ruled out as a suspect. Hector and his wife sued the Chicago police department successfully for about $20,000 after that. Months went by without a lead or even a suspect in these cases. And on June 26, a man named Richard Russell Thomas confessed to murdering Suzanne Degnan. Now, at the time of this call, Richard was living in Phoenix, Arizona, because he was imprisoned for sexually abusing his own daughter. But at the time of the murder, he was in Chicago. And in his confession, a lot of things seemed to line up with the case. Handwriting analysis of Richard Russell Thomas matched pretty similarly to that of the ransom note when he was writing with his left hand. He had been a nurse, so that definitely gave him access to medical equipment, and he definitely had the medical knowledge. He used to actually joke about pretending to be a surgeon, and though he lived a little far from the Degnan house, he was often seen visiting a car yard that was directly across the street. Thomas also already had a history of violence, not to mention the fact that he was in jail for molesting his own daughter, but he also on several instances beat his wife. However, there were some parts of his confession that didn't really line up. He talked about some of the locations that he placed the pieces of the body, and they weren't consistent with where they were actually found. A few days after he recanted his confession, but ultimately I think police just didn't like him for the murder. The same exact day that Richard Russell Thomas called to confess the murder of Suzanne Degnan, there was a 17-year-old boy who was found burglarizing someone else's home in Chicago. They got a call about a college student who was fleeing from a burglary, and he had tried to fire the gun at one of the officers that was chasing him, but it misfired, and a cop who was off duty and lived in that building was at the top of the staircase, and he ended up dropping 3 clay flower pots on the boy's head, and by the third one he was knocked unconscious. 17-year-old William Heinz came from a poor family that was living in Chicago, and his police record starts off pretty young. At the age of 13, William had been arrested for carrying a loaded gun, and this kind of led to an investigation, and they found an unused storage shed that he was using for all of his stolen goods, and they found a lot of stolen stuff. All the things that they found in that shed led to him being, I think, held accountable for 11 different burglaries, and he was sent away to a school for wayward boys for several months. Once he was let out of that school, he was arrested again for theft larceny. This time he was sentenced to 3 years to an academy that was operated by Benedictine monks. At this academy, he excelled. He was an example student, he was brilliant, and they actually suggested that he apply for this special advancement program in the University of Chicago. So essentially he skipped all of high school and was able to go to university by the age of 16. William was actually paying for school himself with several jobs that he was working. But soon enough, this led back to his serial burglary while he was attending university. This is his version of the events that took place on June 26, 1946. He was going on a date with his girlfriend that night, so he had to cash a savings bond that he had for $1,000, and because he was going to be carrying around so much money, that's why he had brought the gun with him. He was on his way to the post office to cash the savings bond, and he found out that the post office had been closed. So he thought instead, because the date was tonight, that he would just go burglar some houses for the money. When he did it this time, there was another person, a neighbor, who saw him and called the police, which led to this big police chase. This is where the accounts differ. The officer at the time said that while they were chasing him, William turned around and pulled out the gun and pulled the trigger, but it misfired twice. Heinz says that the officer pulled the gun out on him and was shooting at him, and he jumped at him from the stairs, I guess to avoid being shot. And then that's when the clay pot started hitting him on the head. So getting back, now we're at June 26th, after he was knocked unconscious. He was taken to a hospital to be bandaged up. And then afterwards, they transferred him over to the hospital section of the jail. For 5 days, he was strapped down to a hospital bed while they tried to get some sort of confession off of him for the 3 murders. Meanwhile, as he's being interrogated, they are raiding his parents' home, they're raiding his dorm room, and he also had a locker at a subway station, and pretty much they just found suitcases of stolen goods, including like pictures of Hitler and some Nazi shit, and also a letter to him that was signed George M. Now, while he was strapped down to this hospital for 5 days, they took his fingerprints, they injected him with sodium pentothal, which is truth serum. They gave him a spinal tap without anesthetic, and this was all without his consent, without his parents' consent, and without the chance to get an attorney. While he was still tied to the bed, they did the interrogations, they tortured him, they gave him all of the details of the murders and just kept asking him why he did it. They were really encouraging him to talk and confess to these murders while he's strapped to the bed still. Before he says anything about the murder, the police department has gone to the press and has assured them that they have the man who committed these murders in custody. They came forward and said that they found fingerprints on the ransom note of the Degnan kidnapping and murder that were matched to William Heinz. The police commissioner actually said that they were determined to get a confession out of this young man, saying, quote, "He knows he did it, and he knows we know he did it." After the spinal tap without anesthetic is when William Heinz confessed to all 3 murders, though almost immediately, and even years after, he said that his confession had been coerced during questioning and through all of that torture. Now let's talk about the evidence. The smoking gun was the fingerprint on the ransom note. So let's start with that. They had the ransom note for 6 months, and they were analyzing it for 6 months with no success on any fingerprints. 2 weeks after William Heinz is arrested, they find a fingerprint and identify it as his. Now, in March, before William was even part of the picture, the FBI had publicly noted that the state of the note had been, quote, handled considerably. Now, fast forward a little bit, they considered the fingerprint to be a match because there were 10 points of similarity on the fingerprints. 10 points. The FBI minimum is 12. So in order for it to be a match for the FBI, it has to have at least 12 points of similarity. Out of those 10 points, 9 were loops, which apparently means that these prints could also line up to 65% of the population at time. The next piece of evidence is the handwriting on the ransom note. There was an artist for the Chicago Daily News who was given a pic of the ransom note, and he said that he found hidden indentation writing, which I don't know what that means. He felt like he could identify more of it if he was able to get the ransom note. So they gave him the ransom note, but this broke the chain of custody, which meant that the ransom note was then rendered useless in court. So this artist has this ransom note for quite some time, and again, 2 weeks after William is arrested, he says that the handwriting implicates William Heinz. And now again, in March, way before William's in the picture, the FBI said that they found no hidden indentation writing, quote, indicating either a lack of knowledge on his part or a deliberate attempt to deceive. So I don't really know why we're trusting this artist 2 weeks after Heinz is arrested. The FBI went ahead and did their investigation, and they compared William's college notes to the ransom note, and they pretty much said that there were no similarities in the writing. A handwriting analyst actually said that there was no connection to Heinz and said that the pieces, quote, do not compare in any respect, end quote. In 1996, there was another analysis done where the FBI pretty much said that none of the handwriting matched up. Not the lipstick on the wall, not the ransom note, and not William's notes, which went back to their original theory in 1946 that the lipstick killer and the horrific crime that was done to Suzanne were not the same person. But anyway, back to the evidence that was presented in 1946. The next one is the polygraph. Now, we know now the polygraph isn't real. There have been a lot of guilty people who pass it and a lot of innocent people who fail it. But anyway, in 1946, William took the polygraph and his results came back inconclusive. One of the reasons that they let Richard Russell Thomas go was because his polygraph came back inconclusive, so they drew the conclusion that he didn't know anything about the murder. The big piece of evidence is also his confessions, but I know that there are plenty of confessions that have been coerced. There is literally a Netflix series about it. And the janitor, Hector, quoted after 2 days of interrogation that anything else, he would have confessed to anything. So I don't really think the confessions go a whole long way here for William. Now here is the big one. This would bring up a lot of questions about William's innocence. William had stolen a lot in his life. He was a burglar. Since he was 13 years old, he was stealing shit. And in these stolen possessions, they found that Nazi shit, which is weird, but it was actually stolen from a man who also had his guns and his knife stolen from him. I would consider asking more questions to that man.
About why he had Nazi shit.
But again, a lot of his stolen possessions were weapons. When they asked William what he did with the hunting knife that killed Suzanne Degnan, and this came from the interrogation that was under the truth serum, and I just think that's important to put out there. He said that he had thrown it at a subway station. So they went to go look for it at the subway station. Some of the, I guess, employees there had found the knife and they put it in the station storage unit. William positively identified the hunting knife as the one that he stole and that he had used on Suzanne Degnan. And the Nazi lover who had his things stolen also confirmed that it was his hunting knife. Now, this is where it gets weird. Remember back when they were investigating his dorm room and William had a note to him that was signed George M? Wow. Let me tell you about George. George comes back because while William is under the truth serum, he says that George is the one who killed Suzanne Degnan. Well, George turns out to be William's alter ego. They thought that George got sexual gratification out of burglary and that it heightened the thrill when he was able to kill as well. On August 7th, 1946, William Heinz took responsibility for the 3 murders. On September 4th, he attempted suicide by hanging, though he was discovered before he died. The next day, on September 5th, William was sentenced to 3 life sentences. While he was waiting to be transferred, a sheriff asked him if Suzanne Degnan suffered while she was being killed. And William responded by saying, quote, "I can't tell you if she suffered, Sheriff. I didn't kill her. Tell Mr. Degnan to please look after his other daughter because whoever killed Suzanne is still out there." Over the years, a lot of people claiming William's innocence have come out. Josephine's oldest daughter doesn't even think that William was responsible for at least her death. Publicly stated in 1946 I cannot believe that young Heinz murdered my mother. He just does not fit into the picture of my mother's death. I have looked at all the things Heinz stole and there was nothing of my mother's things among them. In 2002, they wanted to seek clemency for him and he was denied. The most recent parole hearing was in 2007, but the vote was 14-0 and they denied him again. He became the first prisoner in all of Illinois history to get his 4-year college degree in prison. Heinz was given institutional parole for the Degnan case, and by 1966 he was discharged on that case. So the case of Suzanne Degnan could no longer be legally put as a reason to deny him parole. Heinz should have been then afterwards discharged for the Brown murder in 1975 and all the remaining charges by 1983. But in 1973, the focus of prison moved from rehabilitation to punishment. And there were people who fought for him and fought against it, but ultimately Suzanne's siblings, her older sister and her brother, had fought for him not to get out because they truly believe that he is the one who killed their sister. William Heinz died on March 5th, 2012 due to complications from diabetes at the age of 83. He spent approximately 66 years of his life in prison. Will we ever know whether William Heinz was guilty or innocent? No. Will we ever know if those 3 murders were ever really connected? No. It is not a good feeling. Regardless of whether he committed these horrible, horrible murders, William Heinz will always be known as the lipstick killer. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Once Upon a Murder. Come back for, I will have part 2 of the Manson family murders coming up soon. Comment down below, let me know what you think. Who do you think did it? I'd love to hear your opinions on the case. Like this video, watch my other ones, but yeah.